This episode is sponsored by Component One, makers of Widgmo. If you need stunning UI elements or awesome graphs and charts, then go to widgmo.com and check them out. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 32 of the JavaScript Jabber podcast. I am not your host, Charles Maxwood. I'm Jamison Dance. Chuck is at a conference this week, so he's not here. We have with us Joe Eames.
Hey, everybody.
Tim Caswell.
Hello.
And we have two special guests. I'm going to mangle your name, so I'm sorry, but it's Misko Hevery.
Close enough. Misko Hevery, yes, thank you.
Great. Misko Hevery and Igor Minar. Great. You guys want to introduce yourselves really quick?
Sure. So, as I said, my name is Misko. I am the original creator of Angular.js. And Igor?
Hi, everybody. I'm Igor. I joined Misko about 2 years ago on this venture of creating better browser and better environment for creating client-side applications. So, yeah.
He's been indispensable.
And if you can't tell, we're going to talk about Angular.js this week. So I know it is kind of a Google project now. Did it start out that way?
It started out kind of something I was working on in my free spare time. And then eventually I open sourced and I used it at a product within Google, an internal application. And it just gotten such a rave of reviews and such better feature velocity that Google actually said, hey, why don't you, it's promising, why don't you work on this full time and turn it into a real product? And so that's how it started.
Oh, wow. So there's actually a team of engineers at Google who are working on Angular as their job.
Yes.
Yeah.
We are only.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it's just two of us here now, but we have a bunch of other people working full-time on Angular.js and plus our awesome community contributors. So
go ahead. Sorry.
There's a team behind Angular.js. Yes.
Maybe, do you think you could give an overview and kind of a comparison to contrast Angular to some of the other MVC frameworks that people might be familiar with? I mean, Backbone, I guess, is the one most people know. So maybe what makes Angular different from Backbone? How does it work?
So, I've never used Backbone. That's my disclaimer. So I could say something wrong. So please correct me if I do. But my understanding is that Backbone is basically allows you to declare a model and then watch on changes on this model. And the way it does so is that there's a model class that you have to extend. And then whenever you modify the model state, you use special getters and setter methods so that the Backbone would know about the changes, propagate events. And so this is pretty different from Angular because we don't require you to inherit from anything or use any kind of special getters and setters. Basically any JavaScript object can be a model. So that's one big difference.
But you can still observe the changes on objects like that?
Correct, you can still observe changes on objects like that.
How does that work without any special code?
Everybody asks the question, and it's magic.
That seems like the answer to a lot of questions I have about Angular. It's very magical.
It is very magical, but we try to keep it to the minimum, and we only do magic when we believe it outweighs the cost of the magic outweighs the benefits. The other way around, rather. So how does it work? It basically works that the model can only mutate during certain points in time. It basically means when I set time modifiers, when an XHR comes back from the server, or when the user interacts with the browser. And those are really the only times when you could have model change. And so what you can do is you can hook into this events. You can then run a good old dirty checking. Now it sounds scary, but it actually turns out that the number of bindings you have on a page is what determines how many items you have to check. And because humans can only consume so much data before the page becomes unwindly, typically checking all this stuff is not an issue. It's in single, maybe double-digit millisecond range, something like 10 to 20 millisecond range that you check. And so it actually turns out that it's perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable, even if you have relatively complicated pages, to just simply verify to see if any values have changed.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I've never thought about doing it like that.
So
The benefit being that you don't have to inherit from anything. You don't have to follow any kind of special mechanisms or anything like that. It's just plain old JavaScript that you always know and love.
now, what about the cost? You said it was only 10 to 20 milliseconds, but is it like how complex of a page have you guys tested this with?
Right. So my measuring thing is always something about 2,000 bindings per page. So if you imagine a complicated page, let's say it has 100 rows and 20 columns, then the table would have about 2,000 items on it. And that's pretty much the limit of what you can show to the user before the user is going to kind of scream and say, hey, this page is ridiculous, give me pagination or do something to make the page more presentable. And so that's what we're using as our benchmark.
So I would totally cut you off when you were explaining kind of the basics of Angular, and you only got through one feature. Do you want to talk about some of the other stuff it has too?
Sure. So there's a couple of other things. One of the things that we're most proud of is what we call the HTML compiler. In other words, we allow you to extend the vocabulary of HTML and add behavior to it. So, if you, for example, wanted to go back in time and you wanted to have a blink tag, you can literally teach the browser a new trick by saying, from now on, when you come across a blink tag, we'll reduce this behavior. And this is very different from the worlds of jQuery, where you have an imperative way of specifying behavior by selecting things on a page and then registering listeners, etc. By having this HTML compiler, you can have a declarative way of specifying things by saying, here's my blink tag, here's my pane, here's my tab, here's my accordion, here's my date picker, and so on.
So it seems like some of the work designing an Angular application is figuring out good abstractions to use as, what are they called, like components or something? I can't remember what they're called in the docs.
Directives?
Directives, yeah.
We come with a pretty fine set of directives, things like ng repeat, so you can unroll arrays, ng show and hide, ng model for data binding to input fields, ng view and routers for doing navigation between pages. So there's a rich existing set of things we already have, which we think we have kind of figured out at every application we use. What we expect you as a developer to do is to turn your application into components, right? So if you're building a map application, presumably you would have a map component. If you're building a calendar application, presumably you would have like a day, week, and a month components and so on. Maybe events.
So the approach Angular takes is very different from many of the other solutions, and especially the pre-MVC framework era solutions, because we thought that HTML is pretty awesome at describing static layout of static pages, but it falls short when it comes to building dynamic applications. So we started to think about, why is it and how we can address it and what people do to address this issue. And then, everybody's familiar with jQuery and, or other approaches like Clojure and similar libraries that just abstract away the not so developer friendly DOM APIs that are often inconsistently implemented across browsers, and just make it possible to do DOM manipulation with sane APIs and in a consistent way. But all this DOM manipulation is very imperative. So you are telling the browser, this is the sequence of steps you need to take in order to display something or do some kind of effect. But HTML takes a very different approach. In HTML, you describe, this is the end result, and you let the browser figure out how to get to that end result. And we think that this approach is really good for building web applications. And there are many environments, especially in the desktop world, like WPF or Flex, that showed us that declarative templating and data binding is really awesome. And that's why we thought, could we bring this to the browser, and could we bring it in a way that would feel natural and would feel like browser just knows how to do data binding, how to create declarative templates for web applications. And, we took this route and started implementing Angular.js in a way that is very unintrusive. And as Misko mentioned, one of that, what that means is that we don't ask you to extend any of the framework types or classes, we can work with any kind of type you might have, or just native arrays or objects. And we use HTML as our template, and we just extend HTML just like you will in the future with features like web components that are coming to the web platform in the near future.
Yeah, one of the things it says on the website that I really like is that it's kind of like how you imagine browsers might just work in a couple of years.
Yeah.
Which is neat to be able to work with stuff like that right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, we work very closely with Chrome teams, and we are involved in discussions about the future standards. So some of the standards, like the web component standard, have been affected by the work we've done with Angular.js, and we're kind of prototyping what works and what doesn't, and then the guys who work on specs talk to us, and in this way we can influence standards and tell them, this works for us, or we tried this and it was horrible, it didn't work at all, don't make it a standard. The same thing applies to Object Observe, which is a ECMAScript standard that I think is aimed for ECMAScript 7. It was approved just very recently, and it will allow us to do object-level observation in JavaScript natively. So you'll be able to register observer on any kind of object or array in your application and be notified when any of the properties of that object change. This is very similar to how Angular does model mutation observation, but it's done natively in the browser, so we don't have to do dirty checking, and it's going to be much more performant, and it's going to scale even better than what we can do with JavaScript today.
It's very cool.
So one other thing I wanted to ask about was the way that you kind of hang your application together. It looks like Angular does a lot with dependency injection and passing like controllers into things automatically and passing. I don't know all the Angular terms yet. I've kind of dabbled with it, but haven't built an application with it, so I'm probably mangling stuff. But it uses like toStrings functions and automatically resolves dependencies and stuff. So you don't have to really deal with. Do you think it eliminates the need for a module loader like require or something like that, or does it complement with that?
So actually, I'm going to answer a slightly different question here, and that is, you should ask the question what it doesn't have, specifically because of dependency injection. And so because of dependency injection, Angular doesn't have a main method, something that's very common in other systems.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about what dependency injection is.
Right.
Because
so,
many of the JavaScript developers are not familiar.
So what dependency injection is a declarative way. Notice that we love this declarative theme over and over again. The dependency injection is a declarative way of assembling your application. And because it's declarative, you don't need to write a main method that basically figures out how the application should be assembled. And because it's declarative, in your tests, you can assemble the application differently, replacing components such as authentication or XHRs with pieces that you don't need. The end result is that all the code that you normally write for assembling the app,
like all the instantiation of components and just passing components into another component so that it can use it,
simply doesn't exist in Angular. And so when it comes to modules and module loading, this is the case of overloaded terminology. Angular has a concept of modules, but it means different than modules in case of an AMD or require. AMD or require basically deal with how do I load dependencies. In this case, dependency is a JavaScript dependency into the browser. How do I assemble the application at the code level? Angular's dependency injection system deals with how do I instantiate and assemble the individual classes into an application. And while the two might look similar, they're actually very, very different.
Right.
So, but one nice side effect of using dependency injection in your application is that since you are not in charge of instantiating components, since it's the framework's role to do this kind of thing, then you don't need to worry about the code load order, because the framework can ensure that all the right stuff is loaded, and that's the case with the Angular applications. unless you're using third-party dependencies, there is absolutely no need to use anything like require.js or AMDs or common.js. If you're building a big application, you have many third-party dependencies that are not Angular components and they don't know about dependency injection. That's when require.js and similar loaders come handy, and you can use them in addition to Angular's dependency injection system.
Are there examples of that working in the wild?
I think the Eddie Osmani's To-Do MVC project contains implementation of require.js with Angular.
Okay.
So that's one example to look at. I know of some other applications that I helped with, but I don't think that any of those are open source, as far as I can remember. So I just want to add to this, because many people confuse require.js with dependency injection, and the biggest distinction between the two is require.js doesn't create instances, doesn't create instances of components. It just passes around references to code, and then you instantiate all the components when you need them. With dependency injection hands over to you instances of components. That's the biggest difference between them.
One of the difficulties I have with Angular and just wrapping my head around it is because there isn't a main method, like you said. There's no thread that I can trace back to where all the things come into play. So it seems like there's just this cycle where everything always exists magically. How do you train your brain to get around that?
So it doesn't magically exist all the time. Dependency injection will instantiate components only when they are needed. So components are instantiated lazily. And let's talk a little bit about the main method and why we think it's evil. What is it that you like about the main method?
Just like I said, it's if you are trying to understand an app and you can't figure it out, you can always just go back to the main method and just follow stuff that happens there.
Okay. So what we typically see is that for small applications, main method is fine because it's very simple. It just instantiates one or two components and kicks off the application. But in large applications that have many components, this main method organically grows and becomes very hard to maintain because the order in which you do stuff in the main method really matters. So everybody's on large projects, people are afraid of editing the main method because you don't know what kind of consequences small changes in main method will have. And the other problem with main method is that it ties your application to this particular way of bootstrapping the application. So if you want to bootstrap the application in a different way, using some kind of mock components, let's say you don't want to talk to your database in a unit test, it becomes really hard to figure out how to construct this application for a unit test in a way that will use this model and still preserve all the other components intact.
So I think that that's really one of the most amazing things about Angular is just the whole DI system. I built a pretty large HTML5 player using Angular, and it was just amazing what it could do. And how much that lent itself to testability. And nobody else had really thought about that. And, other systems, especially ones that use require, there's this issue that with require, you're bringing in potentially real objects. And so there's no way to mock them out for testing.
Yeah.
And with Angular, whether you use require or not, it's still Angular that provides you the stuff. So when you go and tell Angular, hey, for this test, use this instead of the real thing, Angular does it all for you and handles it just great.
So I think with require, there are ways to work around this using plugins or some configuration of require.js, but it's not pretty. It's very.
They're so ugly. Oh, they're so ugly.
Yeah, it's very ugly, and it just complicates your life. With dependency injection, things are so much easier because you just ask for dependencies that you need in tests, and they are provided to you. And if you need to override the dependency, you just say, okay, instead of this HTTP client, use this mock client, and everything just works.
I've been moving a lot of my code to dependency injection lately. The library architect I made for Cloud9 is basically the same thing. It sits on top of require and require.js, and instead of requiring some module, you just require some service, and then anything can provide that service.
Yeah. So we were inspired by by Juice and the Java server-side programming models, where Juice and things like Pico Container showed us how to do inversion of control and dependency injection. So both Misko and I are used to be Java developers, and were influenced by Juice.
I deny my history.
Misko denies it, but that's the way it was. I remember it.
My Java background is Swing, so I didn't learn much from that.
Yeah. I actually did.
So, I have a question. I've done a lot of UI frameworks over the years and used a lot of them, and things are all great and easy until you have some nice composite thing you need to build, like a TreeView widget. So, how would you build a TreeView widget in Angular? Like, what techniques would you use?
So we feel very strongly that no matter how much time you spend designing the system, there are going to be cases where you're going to hit this proverbial glass ceiling. And so one of the things we've thought about very hardly in Angular is how do we provide lots of escape hatches so that you can get out and basically figure out a way out of this. And so to us, the answer is this thing we call directives. And with directives, you essentially become a regular, good old jQuery JavaScript. You can do whatever you want.
So think of directive as an instruction to the compiler that tells it whenever you come across this element or this kind of CSS class in the template, execute this kind of code, and that code is in charge of the element and everything below that element in the DOM tree.
Right. So I could just put the entire tree view in one directive, but I probably want to break it up because I've got leaf nodes and tree nodes, and could those be smaller directives with their own element types?
Yes. So on our homepage, we, for example, have an example of panes and tabs, which are two directives that collaborate with each other in order to get the final effect of having a tabbable view. So in the same way, you could set up a individual cell rendering and put it inside of a tree directive, and the tree directive would essentially be a fancy repeater. Instead of repeating over items in sequence, it would repeat over items in a hierarchical fashion. That's what trees are.
Okay, so whatever the problem is, you can build a custom directive that will do it. There's enough flexibility there.
Right. And you can compose directives. That's one thing that we thought really hard of. A directive should be possible to create a directive that is used by another directive that is used by another directive, and this nesting can be as deep as needed. So that's how we extend HTML and make it possible to create these complicated UIs.
So one cool use of that I saw, someone at our company used Angular just because they were interested in it to build out this like backend UI tool really quickly, and we were all pretty amazed by what he did. One cool thing he did was build up a dashboard type of thing, and it was like that with nested directives. So it was like creating graphs, but it wasn't using this normal graph library. It was just using, I think it was a couple jQuery plugins he used to build up his own, basically like graphing HTML tags, but they weren't HTML tags, they were just directives. So it was really cool.
So the way to think about it is that with the use of directives, we essentially allow you to turn HTML into a domain-specific language for creating the app for you.
Yeah, it's a really powerful concept.
It's deep. I gotta let that marinate in my brain for a little bit.
So where is your what the model would be? Where is all your data stored? Is it in these directives themselves, or separate, or does it matter?
So the model is stored in basically your objects that you define yourself. We don't have a model class you inherit from. We don't specify what the model can be. In other words, it's totally up to you to create a model. Whether it's just a plain JSON, which means a bunch of hashes nested into itself, or whether you choose to create a JavaScript types and then instantiate those, that is your choice what the model is. The only requirement is that the model there has to be a reference to the model from the scope. And scope is this glue that sits between directives and the controllers. And so typically what happens is the controller initiates actions such as talking to the server in order to fetch the data, and then take the data and assign it to the scope so that the individual directives can access the model from the scope and then use either data binding or whatever rendering mechanism to use to project it to the user.
So scope is just the object. It's you can think of it like exports in Node.js. It's just the object that you assign stuff to, and then that's available in template. That's how you expose your model to the templating engine, and then we start the mutation observation and update the view whenever necessary.
When I was building my application in Angular and we first started researching it, to me, I started thinking of it as my view model, the scope.
Yep. The scope is, actually that's very true. So there is a lot of controversy about, model view controller, model view model, and all these terms and styles of structuring the code. But I think describing scope as view model is very correct.
And another thing that I think initially confused me just a little bit is the controller didn't end up being an actual object that got used. All it did was create the scope, right? And then it was really no longer anything anymore. It was the scope that was doing everything.
For small apps, that seems to be the case. For large apps, controller would have the behavior specific to that page. Behavior that would be shared across different views would be placed inside of a service and then injected into the controller. But for the most part, the controller is just this thing that sets things up.
Right.
Go ahead.
I have another question. I don't know unless yours was related to this, but I was kind of curious. When we did our application, we were using the HTML5 video component, right? And of course, you don't have any built-in directives for the HTML5 video component. So all the events that it raised, there's no ng dash, like on play or on stop, all those video events. So we ended up wrapping ours in, I think we tried using a directive for a while, and I definitely found that directives were the hardest piece of Angular to grok. So we ended up wrapping it in a service. And then it was the service that handled everything that the HTML5 video player did, and then we just dealt with the scope that way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Do you think that was a poor implementation? It would have been a lot better for us to implement it using a directive?
So we know it's a common criticism that directives are complicated to understand, and I fully hear everybody who says that. I know they're complicated. I spent a lot of time trying to make it simple. I have, to some degree, failed and some degree succeeded. But we hear you. There's some changes in the future to make it simpler. We still feel that directives are the thing that is responsible for talking to the DOM. So in your particular case, it is possible to use services as a way, as a communication channel with the DOM. But it's not really the zen of Angular, right? The zen of Angular is that all of the DOM information should be hidden behind a directive. And so the way you influence the DOM is that you change the model, and then the model becomes projection to the view, to the DOM. If you put things inside of a service, that no longer holds true. Now you've went from a declarative world of DOM into an imperative world like jQuery, and so these benefits, declarative benefits, are starting to be lost. Now, sometimes it's useful to take these shortcuts, but sometimes, if you have a large application, it's useful to invest into doing it through the directives.
It definitely felt wrong to us when we did it.
I wrote the pip code backbone application. What was it called? The music player. I wrote it from Backbone to Angular.js, and in that case, I did use service to wrap the audio element that actually played the music, because that audio element was not part of the visual representation on the page. It was just a way for me to play music, and in that case, it does make sense to wrap it into service. So I don't know what was the particular case in your application, but whenever the directives should be used when you have element in your template that should have extra behavior that you want to define through JavaScript.
Gotcha.
So we kind of touched on this earlier when you were talking about models, but what kind of support does Angular have for syncing stuff with the server? Does it just punt on that question and leave it up to you, or does it have stuff for it?
We leave that, we try to be server-side agnostic, and so it's hard to have an opinion and not be server-side agnostic.
So we provide services that allow you to communicate with the server through HTTP requests and JSON-P. So we have facilities to make either low-level XHR requests or cross-domain XHR or JSON-P requests. And we also have a higher-level service for building basically a RESTful client. So if you want to use REST on your server, we have a way of just generating a very generic RESTful client. What we often find that there are so many dialects of REST out there that it's hard to build a single REST client generator. So there either always have to be a ways to customize this client that is generated, which is the route we took, or there have to be adapters for particular servers. So if you are using Rails, you should be saying, okay, generate me a Rails client. And I think this is a better approach, and that's something we are exploring for the future, where we'll just build a bunch of generators that will just give you, Rails-specific client, or App Engine-specific client, or whatever you have. Because we find that is the easier way to deal with all these dialects on the server.
You mentioned services a couple times in the past few minutes. I don't think we ever really defined what those are. Is there a good definition for what a service is in Angular?
It's a instance of a class that's not a controller.
It's an injectable component. So it's a component that is instantiated by the dependency injection system and is provided to any other component that will ask for it. So let's say, like I mentioned, the audio player or the music player application. In that case, I needed a way of playing music. And the HTML already has the audio tag that if you just set the source and hit instruct it to play, it will just start playing music through your speakers. So what I did, I just created a service. I called it player or audio player. And within the service, I just created detached audio tag and exposed APIs that would allow me to play certain music for certain URLs. And then in my controller, I could just say, if I want to play music, this controller needs an audio player. The dependency injection system will instantiate this component, and the controller can then, whenever you hit the play button or the next button, it will just delegate this piece of work to this component. And breaking down the application into these components is a big part of Angular, because we try to give you a structure for your application, and dependency injection and services play a big part in this. We feel that by creating many small components that create the big application will help you in maintaining the application, because if you have smaller pieces that are focused on a particular task, then it's easier to understand what they do, it's easier to document them, it's easier to maintain them, and very importantly, it's easy to test them as well. So in your test, you can say, I want to test this particular service, and it's very easy to do it because you don't have all these dependencies. The service does just one thing, so you can say, let's test if this plays a music, and you write tests for that specific task. It's not, in jQuery, you often end up writing code that does playing music, fetching data from the server, and updating the UI at the same time. And in order to test this kind of code, you have to either write an end-to-end test, which means you need to bootstrap your entire application and write this very slow test that will verify that the right thing actually happens. And this test is not only slow, but often flaky. Writing the other kind of test that we think is good for applications is the unit test. So unit test targets specific components. It's very fast and allows you to diagnose problems much faster, because if you get an error from a unit test, you know that, this component and this particular task that this component is supposed to be doing is not working properly. Whereas in an end-to-end test, when something goes wrong, there are many components that you need to deal with. You need to diagnose and figure out what is it that went wrong. The surface is much larger.
Yeah, I really feel like with Angular, that testability and then those really just the idea of services are the two things that make it significantly, well, my favorite framework to use, because it encourages you, those services give you a place to stick code that isn't a controller.
Yep.
Yeah, and nobody else has that. I can't remember. I can't count the number of.
What are you
Backbone.
talking about? Those are called views in Backbone.
I cannot count the number of views I've seen in Backbone that are 600 lines long because people just aren't given a place to put it. You know, DHH said one of the most amazing ideas they came up with Rails was an empty directory that just gave people a place to put files. It gave them a place, and that's what services are. They're that empty directory, that place. Put your code in here. Go create some services. We've given you this thing to put your code in so you can make lots of small pieces rather than, a 600 line long view.
Right. So and I'm very happy to hear that you like the testability story of Angular, because that's one of our key goals. We really want to build large applications that are maintainable. And in order to do that, we feel that testing must be something that is baked into the solution. It cannot be an add-on. It cannot be something that was just added later. It must be baked into the framework, and the whole development workflow must work in a way where testing is first-class citizen. And we do this not only through the dependency injection and the guidelines we give you to structure your application, but also by providing tools for writing and running tests. So we integrate really well with Jasmine or Mocha. And we also have a test runner, which is actually not Angular specific. It's called Testacular. And what it allows you to do is to run unit tests in real browsers. So if you want to just test your application, it will just start Chrome with a empty profile. It will execute all of the unit tests in Chrome and it will report back to you. And even better is that it will watch the file system and it will understand the structure of your application. And whenever you change source or test source code, then it will rerun the test and will report, oh, you broke something just now, or everything's still working. So what we get out of this is a workflow where we run all of our unit tests on every file save. So with Angular.js itself, we have 1,600 unit tests, which test all the DOM manipulation, all the service interactions, and all the craziness that is happening behind the scenes. And we can run all these tests within few seconds. So I think in Chrome and Safari, it's about 4 seconds. So with this kind of development, you can get a really rapid response in did my recent change break something or not? And you're really confident about your application, and you just change the way you think about writing the code.
Should we pause for a sec?
Yeah.
Move?
Yep.
We're getting pretty close to where we need to wrap it up too. All right. So, are there any final questions? If not, we'll get to the picks. We're running up against our time limit. I don't
want to make give a question. I just want to make a comment on everything that you just said about testability and say that's what I just love that. If you were here in this room, I would kiss you full in the mouth.
Oh boy.
We love to hear when people tell us that this is awesome, because we honestly believe that this makes Angular special, and we would like to encourage other frameworks, other libraries, and the entire JavaScript community to just rethink the way they write the code and start thinking about testability first, or testability as one of the primary goals of whatever API is it that they are building.
Right, not just testing yourself, but
yeah,
also enabling others to use you to have a testing story.
So I see two main benefits in Angular, and these are two different brilliant ideas. One, of course, is the dependency injection, which we've been talking about. And then the other is the directives, which is a way to do declarative programming. And I think they're independent ideas that other frameworks can pick one or the other depending on what they like. I mean, I prefer procedural direct code on small apps, but I could still use dependency injection and have services.
Yep.
One of the sayings we have in the Node community is, there's a question, it's like, how do you build a large program? How do you make it maintainable? And the answer is, well, you don't. You just make a bunch of small modular
Yep.
components and integrate them well. And
Exactly.
dependency injection makes that possible.
Yes.
Yeah, so I still say that these are very unique features that nobody else has. As far as I know, we're the only framework that has dependency injection. We're the only framework that allows you to extend the HTML vocabulary.
Also, the way we do data binding and the two-way data binding is very, very unique, and I don't think anybody's as close to bringing a smooth data binding to developers as Angular is.
And I'd also like to point out that if you look at Angular controllers, it's completely void of any kind of Angular API. It's just pure JavaScript.
So I really like what you said about two-way data binding. I think you can probably say that any large enough backbone application will have its own bad implementation of data binding. So it's really cool to see it built into the app.
Yeah.
Are there any last things before we get to the picks?
Can't think of anything.
Anything you wish you had said already that you didn't get a chance to?
Hi, I'm AJ, and I'm coming at you live from the place in Orem where I am.
All right, just in time, AJ.
Good timing.
All right, let's get to
So
the
we
picks.
would like to
Go ahead.
just thank you for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to talk about Angular.js here. I enjoy your podcast, and it's great to be here with you.
I'm really glad you guys came on. Angular is like this mysterious, beautiful beast that I just kind of stare at and poke at every once in a while, and really like to get more into. So I think this might push me over the hill to actually building stuff with it.
So our real goal is, to make the browser smarter and to prototype ways how this can be done, and help the developer community today to build applications in a simple and beautiful way, but also influence the standards that are coming and make sure that there are better primitives in the browser, in the web platform, that would allow us to do even more and even bring even smoother development workflows to the developers.
I just want to end the suffering of all the endless developers who have to write imperative code and are stuck in endless loops and closure, indentation hell as you doing callback.
The Pyramid of Doom. Well,
And,
here's the end of the Pyramid of Doom.
and those developers were stuck without tests as well.
Indeed. All right, we really do have to get to the picks. There's so much interesting stuff to say. I'm sorry to cut it off, but we don't want to keep people for too long. So
Right.
let's start it off.
I do have one last question. Are you hiring?
Are we hiring? Oh, yes, we are hiring. Actually, we are. So we are always looking for JavaScript ninjas and people who are willing to do crazy things and just challenge the status quo, because that's what many of the pieces of Angular do. Like, many of the things you find in Angular are not something you would see elsewhere. And we think that rethinking the way we do development is important. And we're looking for people who have this approach and are willing to look out of the box and just think out of the box and come up with new ways of building applications. So if you feel like we are one of them, let us know, and we'll be happy to talk to you.
Great. All right, let's get to the picks now. So, Joe, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so my first pick is going to be Angular. I don't know if you've heard of it.
That's cheating.
No, my only pick this week is the show, The Arrow, that was on the CW.
What is it?
The Arrow. It's a Green Arrow TV show.
Oh.
It's called The Arrow.
Right on. Is that it?
That's it.
AJ, do you have any picks?
Come back to me in a second.
Okay. Tim.
Yes. I would like to pick Font Awesome, which is a web font icon library. I've been using it, and it's got some really cool stuff in it. I think it's feature parity with the icons in Twitter Bootstrap, but it's all through fonts. So you can do cool stuff like CSS inner shadows and whatever you want. And I've been using it for some little apps I've been building.
We use Font Awesome on Angular website as well. Good choice.
That's cool. Is that it, Tim?
That's it.
Sweet.
Mishko, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go first. So I have two picks. Testacular. I would really like people to check it out because I think it's awesome. If you do unit testing or you can do end-to-end testing, but that's not the primary focus. It's really the unit testing. And you want to run your unit tests really, really quickly in real browsers, then check out Testacular. And
How about you get some numbers, like how much faster is it?
well, I already mentioned, 1,600 unit tests in 2 to 4 seconds.
But in Jasmine, which is not using Testacular.
It's minutes. So
It's minutes.
if you're using Jasmine, you can still use Jasmine. Testacular will just run the Jasmine test for you. If you're using Mocha, you can use Mocha. Testacular will just run the tests for you in the real browser. It's super fast, and people just love it. Everybody who has seen it, I haven't seen one bad word about it. And the second pick is Plunker. Plunker is just like JS Fiddle, or the general idea of JS Fiddle, but it's done right. It's the editor is something that is awesome because they use Ace Editor, so it's the editor that you would see in Cloud9. I always find myself really frustrated with the JS Fiddle editor. That's not the case with Plunker. Plunker also allows you to break your small application that you're writing in multiple files. Definitely check it out. It's really worth it. You won't be disappointed.
Great. That sounds really cool. Igor, do you want to go?
Mishko.
That was Igor.
Oh, that was Igor. Okay, Misko.
So I'm going to end that non-technical term. I've been reading this awesome book called Better Angels of Ourselves. It actually looks at history of people and how they got friendly, less violent, and so on over millennia. It really opens up my mind. So I thought I'd share it with you guys.
I've actually heard of that book. That's the second time someone's recommended it to me. I'll have to check it out. I'll go next, I guess. Were you done? Sorry,
Yes.
I didn't want to cut you off. Okay. Alright. So, this game called XCOM came out this week. And it's a remake of a classic, strategy, tactical, turn-based combat game from 1993, which is one of the best games ever made. So I had really high hopes for this game, was also kind of scared of it because it could just murder my baby. And they did a great job. It's easy enough to pick up if you haven't played the old game yet, but it's still really true to its spirit, I guess. So it's a sci-fi game where you control this organization that is kind of defending the world from an alien invasion. So you have this base building part and global strategic management part, but then you actually go on missions and have these tactical turn-based squad combat battles with aliens. So it's a great game. And then my other pick is just the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. I read them when I was a little kid a long time ago, and I remember liking them, but I'm just reading them again, almost done with the last book, and they're so good. They're great. It's just classic, wonderful sci-fi. So if you haven't read those yet, definitely check them out. AJ, what's your pick or picks?
So I've been listening to this book, Influencer. I didn't mention that before, did I?
I don't know. So.
Okay, good. So it's Influencer, The Power to Change Anything. And it's interesting because it comes from the perspective of, it's kind of like Blink and a couple other books, or maybe Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, or something like that. It's in that genre. It focuses on the finding out where the outliers are of the results that you want. So say you want to lose weight. Look at people who are fat and find the ones that are losing weight, and then figure out what they're doing different from you. Or if you're in a company and you want to, you want people to be more safe, look at the departments where people are having fewer injuries and try to figure out what they're doing different. So it's the reverse approach of, intuitively, a lot of times we just, we think up solutions, and then we try to implement them and experiment with them. But in a lot of cases, the solution to a problem already exists. Somebody's already using that solution, so you don't have to think about the solution or invent it. You just have to kind of see. You have to use your skills to find out who's already got it and then why it's working for them. And so it's been interesting to listen to, and it's made me think about a lot of things from business to relationships to whatever, just how to influence my life to get the results that I want.
Cool. That sounds really interesting. Misko and Igor, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was
Thank you for having
really
us.
informative, and hopefully you guys who are listening liked it too. See you guys next week.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, see you
Adios.
later.